Hi everyone, this is Amsterdam Comic Geek speaking, aka Michael Minabo, and Dominic of the Comic Book Report asked the question, what first got you into comics? And I'd like to answer that question with this little video. When I was about 9 years old, a friend of mine from elementary school had a big stack of comics in his living room when I came there to play, and those comics belonged to his older brother. Now, these were Dutch translations of Marvel comics, especially Spider-Man. So Amazing Spider-Man was published in this magazine and it was called the Spectaculaire Spider-Man because spectaculaire means amazing in Dutch. And they were roughly number 30 till number 72, if I remember correctly. And I just got a couple of them from my collection to show you those Dutch collections. So this is the introduction of Madame Web. These are stories written by Danny O'Neill. He was writing Spider-Man at the time, and John Romita Jr. is the penciler on these comics. And as you can see here, the lettering was done by a type machine, by a typewriter or something. So it wasn't hand lettered like the American comics were back in the day, where they were, oh, yeah, they used a typewriter or something. And most of the time they collected 3 American comics in 2 Dutch comics, so there were 32 pages each. So 1.5 comic was collected in 1 Dutch comic. So you always had to buy basically 2 comics to get the whole story if it was a 2-parter or a 3-parter. Also, this one is a great story. This is The Fool Killer. This was my first introduction to The Fool Killer. And this is when Roger Stern is the writer of Spider-Man, who is still my favorite Spider-Man writer of all time, still to this day. And John Romita Jr. was still doing the pencils in this one. And this stack of comics, that friend of mine, his name was Peter, he let me lend them so I could read them at home. And it was an introduction to the Marvel Universe and Spider-Man in particular. And here's the Hobgoblin. This is the first appearance in a Dust magazine of the Hobgoblin. And I've been a fan of comics and Spider-Man in particular ever since. This is a great story about the Vulture. And Roger Stern gives the origin story of the Vulture. And again, sometimes it's handwritten when it comes to the typeface of newspapers, as most of the time it was just typed. Later on they used computers, of course, but back in the day it looked like this, these Dutch translations. And later on in this stack of comics, the stories were penciled by Ron Frenz, and Tom DeFalco was the writer of these stories. This is a advertisement for Secret Wars, the Dutch edition of Secret Wars, called Geheime Oorlogen in Dutch. Although that probably sounds really weird to you guys when you hear Dutch, but so when I got older, well, not really. Let's say when I was about 10 years old, I started collecting comics myself, the Spider-Man ones, and all the 3 series were published in Dutch. So you had Amazing Spider-Man in the Spectaculaire Spider-Man. Also, Spectacular Spider-Man was published in Dutch, and Web of Spider-Man. This is still one of my favorite comic book covers by Ron Frenz. And I remember reading this comic when I was young vividly. But this is how it started. This is how my love for comics started, with Dutch translations. And when I was in my teens and later on, I of course started to collect them in the American comic books, in the American format. But nowadays I still like to read these Dutch comics as well. So I got a lot of stories double in my collection. I have the Dutch translations and the American trade paperbacks of these stories. Anyway, I hope you like this video. Let me know what you think. Like, subscribe, but most importantly, have a great day, as some other YouTubers say, and I can only concur with that. Anyway, thank you very much, and check out the Comic Book Report because he has a great comic book channel as well.